Okay, we are underway tonight, and I want to start off by welcoming everyone. We're going to have a really big crew. I bet you before everything is said and done, we'll probably have close to 50 people tonight. So it's going to be really crowded. Make sure we mind our manners, but you're in for a treat tonight. This is not one of our standard Wildlife for You webinars where we're teaching you about wildlife. This is a relaxed, holiday fun conversation that we're going to have. And this is the fourth time we're doing this class. It's known as Bear Tales. And I always bring in Kim DeLozier because I think Kim probably has handled more bears than any of us have ever seen. And for those of you who don't know who Kim DeLozier is, he's the retired bear biologist from Great Smoky Mountain National Park, but I'll let him introduce himself. But as we get underway here, like I said, we want you to sit back, relax, drag the kids in, drag family and friends in. Enjoy tonight's presentation. We're going to be telling stories. We're going to be answering your questions. We want you to participate. And so with that, we're going to get underway with today's presentation of Bear Tales. So to get things started off, I do want to officially introduce both people tonight, me being one of them, but I'm going to let Kim DeLozier introduce himself first and give you a little bit of background information about him, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my background as well.
Okay. Thank you, Daryl. It's good to be with you tonight, and I appreciate everybody being a part of this as well, too. It's interesting format to be able to do it this way, but obviously you can reach many more people over large areas by going this route, too. So good. It's good. It's a good way to try to get information out too. But really, I think tonight's going to be different. I hope we can provide some information to you, and it'll be fun to hear and experience, plus also learn some good things as well too. But anyway, I do live here in Seymour, Tennessee. I went to University of Tennessee. Got my degree in wildlife and fisheries science, and typically, what most people do, if they're in wildlife, they'll go in to get their master's, and even some will get their PhD. But I'm a little different, as I'm told a lot. But anyway, I had a opportunity for a permanent job really just before I got finished with my bachelor's at UT, and so I took the opportunity and started working for the park in 1979. And stayed there for 32 years and retired about 10 years ago, actually 9 years ago too. So now I work for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. I work on elk restoration, work on habitat work. We have elk in many states here in the east, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Missouri, Virginia, and West Virginia. So we've been part of most of those programs with the Elk Foundation too. So what we're trying to do is really get these herds established in areas where people actually want a herd of elk as well. So it's been a really good job. I also teach classes for a company called Safe Capture International on chemical immobilization of wildlife. The company just changed hands with San Diego Zoo Academy, and so I'm going to be my first class this next year is going to be at the University of Georgia at the vet school in February too. So anyway, that's kind of just a nutshell. I'm a pretty simple person. I actually grew up on a farm and kind of a farm boy, I guess you could probably say too. But actually lucked out, and I got a job actually working in wildlife and fisheries science. And if I had if I could roll time back, would I do the same thing all over again? Absolutely, I would. I've been very, very blessed to be able to experience the things that I have. So, Daryl, that's kind of all I've got for the intro.
Okay. Let me introduce myself. For those that don't know me, I'm Daryl Radijak. I'm the founder of this Wildlife for You program. We bring in wildlife biologists from all over North America to do this. But to give you a little bit of background information with me, I'm blessed just like Kim was in the fact that after I got my degree in wildlife management back in the early 90s, I ended up taking a job in Tennessee, and I was managing a place called the Appalachian Bear Center. Most of you now know that as the Appalachian Bear Rescue. That's actually where I met Kim DeLozier. That was over 20 years ago. And I did that job, fantastic job, one of the greatest jobs I ever had, but it didn't really pay a lot back then, and so I started working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and because of my experience with black bears, they promoted me to be the big game coordinator. So I was over deer, bear, elk, all the big charismatic megafauna in Tennessee. I did that for about 7 years, and then the director saw something in me, and he promoted me again to chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. And I did that for another 5 years. That was awesome because I was over all wildlife, but it involved being dressed in a suit and attending meetings and talking to commissioners, and you weren't really dealing or really diving into the wildlife world. It was more of an administrative type of position. And so about 4 years ago, I decided to take a leap. As a little boy, I always wanted to live and work in the Rockies. And when you work for the state of Tennessee, the furthest west you can go is Memphis, and that wasn't far enough. And so 4 years ago, I left, moved out. I've been living in northern New Mexico for the last 4 years. Still have a main job that pays all the bills, but I do this. This is my passion. Talking to people about wildlife is my passion. But I've been working with other big game animals literally my whole career. So between myself and Kim, we've got over 50 years, well over 50 years of handling bears, dealing with all sorts of other wildlife. And we want to spend tonight, I'm going to have Kim as our featured speaker, but we want to spend tonight kind of sharing some stories with you, answering your questions, going wherever you guys want to lead us. So with that, what I did a few weeks ago on our Facebook page is I put out a question. If you were to attend this webinar tonight, what would you like to ask myself or Kim Delozier? And so we prepared a couple of slides just to get the conversation started. But from this point forward, like I said, we want you to lead us in different directions. But what I'm going to do is start with one of the questions from the peanut gallery that we received. And I'll let Kim answer first. So Melissa Whitson asked a question, since both Kim and I worked at the Bear Center, who is your favorite ABR bear? And Kim, I'll let you talk for a little bit. I gotta help someone who's having issues. So take it away, Kim.
Sure. My favorite ABR bear. Of course, there was a lot of them. You know, the early years, ABR was not very organized at all, but we knew there was a major need. And I remember the way ABR kind of got started too. It was really because that we had no place. Biologists had no place to put a bear in a facility that was either orphaned or injured, to keep it there without it basically become a pet around people and becoming imprinted on people. So that was our biggest need. It kind of started from back in 1988, I believe it was, with Operation Smoky, which was a covert operation dealing in trying to catch people that were dealing with bear parts, teeth, claws, just different parts as well too, gallbladders, and so that's kind of in the forefront. And a lot of people started hearing about that, really didn't know that that was actually going on, and so they people were calling me at the park, said, "Hey, what can I do to help?" And so one lady wanted to raise money to buy machine guns so that the rangers could kill poachers. I said, "Well, I really appreciate your enthusiasm. I really appreciate you willing to be able to help out, but that's probably something that we can't do here in the Smokies or anywhere else in the U.S. too." So anyway, I explained to her. I said, "Really, what we really need is a place where we can keep bears," because I had just had to euthanize a little cub and stuff too. We had nowhere to put it. Typically, zoos are full of bears. They raise their own cubs, and rather than just releasing the bear out in the wild and letting nature take its course, you kind of know what's probably going to happen with that very young animal too. And so we basically didn't have many options with bears in the early years. Some of them we put in a large cage, kept them for a period of time, treated them, released them, and just hope for the best too. But to answer the question, probably my favorite one was a bear that was called Chester, and I probably been written a lot about Chester, and I can just tell you what I recall my involvement with him. I was in park headquarters, and I had someone call me and said, "Hey, there's a little small bear here behind park headquarters that You have to come and help it. You have to come and help it now. So what's wrong with it? He said it's one of its legs is broken, shoulder broken, something like that. So I said, okay. So I went down and got my equipment, my drug kit, things like that. Went back up and found this poor little old bear. I mean, it was limping on one leg. It was really really struggling to be able to limp or to actually walk. And so why, I'm not really for sure. You know, they can fall out of trees and break a leg or mess up a shoulder too. The mother could have swatted at it and basically hit it, trying to wean it too, because it was the time of year that yearlings at that point were being kicked out by their mother, and some of the yearlings are not very cooperative too. They want to stay with mama too. So mama sometimes has to be pretty forceful to people to be able to get those animals away from them too. Sometimes the mother will share her territory with her cub or yearling if it's a female. Typically, the males typically have to go too. So this little cub or yearling was walking up, pretty thin, limping on that, and people were just really said, we have to do something. So we went and actually captured it. Remember, we took it to the UT Vet School, which was kind of our place to take them and try to get them fixed if we could. And we took it down there, and remember, they had to do surgery on it and had to put a plate in the leg to be able to set the leg as well. Then it went to Appalachian Bear Rescue, and it stayed there for a period of time too. And we went back in, I think, and it re-examined the animal too, and the leg was not healing, so it had to go back to the University of Tennessee, and they actually had to do surgery again. Went back to ABR and stayed there, I think, over the winter time until the springtime. If I remember correctly too, we took Chester up the road from park headquarters there near Gatlinburg. A couple miles up, we backed the truck up. I backed it up to a curb, and we actually put a board, a piece of plywood where the animal could run down there, wouldn't jump on its leg and hopefully re-injure it too, and let Chester go. Chester took off. I mean, the media was there. It went without a hitch. It ran down the woods. Chester was gone. We did not have any radio collars on it at that time, only ear tags. So we thought Chester would never be seen again, but lo and behold, sometime later, I got a call from a lady who owns the Swag Hotel, Deaner Williams, over on the mountain between Cataloochee in the park and Maggie Valley outside the park. And she called me and she says, Ken, we've got a small bear here that's eating apples in the apple tree, and it's just staying here the whole time. And so anyway, I said, okay, well, I'll send someone over there. So I sent Rick Varner over there to capture the bear. And just the whole process of actually capturing the bear, measure it, weighing it, and then reversing it and waking it back up, that's a negative experience. I don't think it's necessarily hurtful for the animal, but it's just an animal's being handled, captured by a person, and they don't necessarily like that. So we did that kind of as a negative reinforcement for this bear to leave this area and stay away from people too. So when Rick got the bear in hand, he looked at it, and sure enough, he looked at the ear tag number, called back and asked who it was, and I told him the history. It was Chester. So Chester had traveled on its own probably 30 miles or so over to the Swag Hotel too, and once we released him, we never heard from him again too. And I hope that's a happy end to the story. Had a long history with him too, but I think we did the best we could to be able to get him back out in the wild where he could live as natural as a wild bear as possible. So that's probably my favorite one, Daryl.
Good deal. As you know, since I worked at the Bear Center, in the 4.5 years I was there, I handled 43 bears, many of which that Kim brought to me. And so when I sat here and thought about this question, there's so many unique bears that the stories alone, it's like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. So it was rather difficult trying to figure out which was my favorite bear, because there's a couple that just have absolutely phenomenal stories and backgrounds to them. But if I've got to pick one, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to finish a story that I started on the Facebook page last week because it was a teaser about tonight's Bear Tales. Typically, every bear that came into the Bear Center gets released back into the wild. So because of that, you don't have contact with them. You don't play with them. You don't interact with them. And that's the way it should be. That's what I preferred. But one time we had this bear come in, and I was called, a TWRA, a Tennessee Wildlife Resources agent, had this bear that needed to come to the center. And so I drove way up northeast Tennessee to pick up this bear, and I was prepared with a catch pole, heavy-duty gloves. It was going to be about a 20, 25-pound cub. And when I got there, I met him in a Kmart parking lot, and it was almost dark. And I was down in the battle gear to get this cub out of the cage and into the cage that I had in my Jeep Wrangler. And he looked at me and looked back at the bear, and he smiled. He's like, "This ain't a normal cub." And he opened the door, and that cub ran out and jumped into his arms. And that's not good. Wild bears are not friendly. They should not ever be friendly with people. And so he walked over, put the bear in my cage, thanked me, and drove off. And so I was left there thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Because obviously this bear was habituated, and the Bear Center set up to release bears into the wild. And imagine releasing a bear into the wild that loves jumping in people's laps. You can't do it. So I drove home that night, put the bear in the maintenance building to figure out what we're going to do. And as I was putting him in, I heard him wheezing on the drive home, which wasn't normal. It didn't really concern me too much because bears could get sick just like people. But as I was locking up the maintenance building, I heard him cough. Bears don't cough. And so the next morning, I made an appointment with Dr. Ed Ramsey at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. And so I took the bear in just to be analyzed, see what was going on. And they did all the x-rays, and Dr. Ramsey comes out, and he tells me that this cub had aspiration pneumonia, which explained a lot, because aspiration pneumonia, you oftentimes get that if an animal is bottle fed wrong and they get liquid in their lungs. And I at the time didn't know how serious it was, and so we loaded the bear back in the cage to take back to the Bear Center, and Dr. Ramsey said, "Don't be surprised if he doesn't make it through the night." And that was like a big weight on my shoulders. I didn't realize the bear was that bad off. And so I drove back to the center in a pretty sour mood. And so that evening I went down to feed the bear, and he was still sitting in the little cage in the maintenance building. And I figured, you know what, if this is going to be his last night, I'm going to make it a good night for him. So typically we feed all natural foods, apples, pears, acorns, all that other stuff. But because this was potentially his last meal, I gave him peanut butter, just things that aren't typically or should never be fed to a wild bear. And so he loved it. He lapped it up. It seemed to cheer him up a little bit. And so when all was said and done, it was about 9 o'clock at night, I was feeling a little bad knowing he might not make it through the night. So I locked up his cage, and as I was leaving the maintenance building, he started bawling, just crying like you wouldn't believe. And I walked away. I went up to the house that we had, which was a single-wide trailer, and I was sitting in the recliner, and all I could hear in my mind was him crying because he was comforted by people. He was raised by people. And I said, son of a gun, I'm not going to let this cub die alone if I could help him and comfort him. So I went back down to the maintenance building, and as soon as I came in, he got all excited and happy. And so I sat there, and again, I dealt with wild bears, and so wild bears, you don't want to get near them because they will tear you apart, even the little ones. But this one, I saw jump in the arms of that wildlife officer. And so I stuck the knuckle of my finger in, and he immediately started second on it. He was comforted. And the cool thing, Kim, you probably heard this before. You ever hear where the bears almost purr? They're vibrating because they're so content. That bear was doing that. And so I sat there and I thought, you know what? Is against my better judgment. I made sure the door was locked, that I wouldn't have another Houdini episode. But I decided to let him out of his cage because he really enjoyed my company. And so as soon as I opened the door to his cage, he jumped in my lap, and it was literally like a little miniature bear hug. He just liked being comforted by people. And that was something that was crazy cool. Like I said, you never get that opportunity. So I hung out with him for about an hour or so, and now it's about 10, 11 o'clock at night, and it was time to go to bed. We had our fun, so I go to put him in the cage, and I pick him up by the scruff of the neck, and I go to put him in the cage, and he sticks his arms out and grabs all four corners of the cage door, and I'm trying to push him in. It's like a little trampoline on that door. I was pushing him in, he was pushing out. And I'm like, oh no, what am I going to do? And I could not. After I did that, he turned around and grabbed my leg, and I think he intentionally sunk his claws into my calf because it scared me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it dawned on me I've got a bear cub that I'm dealing with now. And so I sat down there. I wasn't too worried, but I couldn't get him back in his cage. And so after another hour or two, it was well past midnight, I looked around the maintenance building, and I found an old tarp and a old blanket. So I laid down. Lo and behold, I eventually fell asleep. And I remember the next morning, the sunlight started breaking through the window, and I opened my eyes, and I was laying with my arm outstretched, and that little bear was asleep. I was spooning a bear. And so I think I'm probably the only one on the face of this earth that could say that I woke up spooning a black bear. And so fortunately, he was still pretty much out of it. I was able to get him back in the cage. And it dawned on me, he survived. He did fine. We had medication. Because of his behaviors, he could never be released to the wild. But we did find a sanctuary for him to go to. And that was one of the only bears that we ever put in a zoo or a sanctuary because, like I said, the Bear Center always dealt with wild bears. So that's my favorite story, and I'm sticking to it. I've got a ton of others, but I'm going to let Kim get back to his storytelling. So.
You know, Daryl, I might add one thing. You're talking about the little nursing sound, and it's actually really loud. It's if you walk through the woods, and you actually can hear cubs nursing their mother actually up in the den. It is really loud. Now, I guess the way I describe the sound would be kind of if you remember the old electric typewriters, if you just held one of the keys down, it kind of run across the board back and forth. That's kind of what it reminded me of that sound as well too. But it's very unique too. But you know what it is after you hear it one time with these cubs actually nursing their mother too.
Yeah, and where I heard it most when I was taking care of the neonatals, when you were nursing them and they're just so content, it's literally like a purring, but their whole body vibrates. It's like a vibration sound that you hear. It's really unique, but it's really cool once you know that it's a good sound. When the bears are doing that, the bears are pretty content.
I'm gonna tell you one quick story that happened up in Newfound Gap. We typically don't put wild bears in zoos as well either, because most of the time zoos, like I said earlier, are full of bears and they have their own cubs and they have to find a place to put the cubs that they raise as well too. But on Sunday afternoon, I got a call from park headquarters, the dispatch, and said, hey, we've had a lady attacked by a bear up at Newfound Gap. And I said, is she hurt? And they said, to our knowledge, she's not hurt. She said the bear just grabbed her leg and she was able to get away from it. She said she actually was dragging the bear across the parking lot. And I said, really? So I sent someone up there. I called them, said, come up there, take the trap. They went up and actually caught the bear. And about that same time, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission had passed some policies and laws where they were going to confiscate captive black bears that people had at their home. So lo and behold, before they actually went to confiscate those bears, guess what happened? Some of them escaped. And so I'm just assuming this was one of those bears. I don't know that for sure. But anyway, the story was this lady said that she was walking across the parking lot at Newfound Gap, and the bear came out of the woods and ran over to her and grabbed her leg and would not let go. Of course, she was extremely upset, as you might guess, was actually dragging the bear across the parking lot, latched onto her leg, and she was able to get away from the bear and get back in the vehicle too. Well, we caught the bear too, and we anesthetized it, put it down, and lo and behold, the claws had actually been removed. So it had been declawed, and it was obviously a captive bear that someone had released in the park, thinking it's going to live happily ever after. And pretty naive to think so, but they did. So, here's a bear that was a captive bear. It wasn't typically a wild bear, and so a guy that I work with was from Indiana, and he said that he knew a zoo there that actually had just lost their bear to cancer. And so I started making phone calls, and they wanted the bear, and I did a tremendous amount of work on permits to move that bear from the Smokies all the way up to Parker City, Indiana. And we took the bear up there, and she lived her life out there in that setting too. So that's kind of a unique thing for us, but we did have that happen on that one occasion.
Yeah, it is definitely difficult to find. That's why we don't even want to try it, because it's all closed doors, and the worst thing to do is to have a bear there that you can't find a home with. So,
yeah.
What we're going to
go ahead, Daryl. I think a lot of people don't realize that once a bear loses its fear of people and becomes food conditioned to people, I kind of use the terms habituated and food conditioned. Once they're habituated, my term for that, or description for that, is a bear that feeds around people naturally, but very, very close to trails, roads, houses, things like that too. But they're not connected to us, with our food, and so food condition is that. But once they become a food condition too, it's really hard to break that behavior too. And at least, I'm not saying you can't, but it's extremely tough to ever do that. They've tried Karelian bear dogs. They've tried electric fences. We've tried a variety of things as well in the Smokies. And the key is to catch it early. Nip it in the bud before it becomes too established. And we've had some luck trying to use aversive conditioning on bears that are still not active in a picnic area before they become day active and become too established too. So that's kind of just a real quick recap of that. One thing I remember, one story. This is actually before Appalachian Bear Center. I got a call. This was probably in the late 80s. No, take it back, late 70s or early 80s, and we had a call that someone actually had poached a bear at Chimney's picnic area. And in the book, we've actually got a story about this little incident too, called Skydiving Bear. And I went up there, and someone actually had poached the mother the night before. And there was a little orphan cub, I assume from the mother, up at the top of a silver bell tree. And so I looked up there, and it was a long way. I remember National Geographic happened to be in the area. They were there filming, and a lot of people were there too. And so wasn't a lot of video cameras at that time compared to what we have today. But anyway, I was just kind of cutting my teeth on wildlife management too, and so I thought you could just physically climb up this tree and catch this bear, and things would be fine. Well, I found out otherwise. That's not necessarily the case. So I used a 16-foot ladder. I put it on the tree, climbed up there. I used some screw-in steps actually to step up higher on the tree. And then my plan was to go up with let's see, like an 8 to 12-foot catch pole, slide it up the tree while I'm still holding on with one arm, and then try to put the noose around the bear, tighten it up, and then jerk the bear cub away from the tree, lower it down, release it, and let them catch it in a net. At least that was my plan. Well, we got up there, and he was up the tree, and it was blowing. They actually will stick their upper lip out because they feel threatening. They'll blow at you, basically, in kind of a threatening type manner. Well, I got up, and I got the catch pole and go higher, higher, higher. The moment I touched that little rascal, I mean, he come down that tree like he was in an elevator. And I looked around and I knew there wasn't enough room for both he and I to cross, so I wasn't for sure what was going to happen. He got down on the other side of the tree, very close to my face, and I was leaned back so he couldn't actually swat me in the face. And I instinctively just reached around and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, jerked him away from the tree, and yelled down to open the net up. So they opened this, actually, it was a net that we used to construct to build a hog trap out of. So I held him up and I wished him well, and I let him go, and down he went. So he looked like a person skydiving is what he did, but I'm sure he's pretty scared. But he hit the net. They kind of gathered it up, caught him, and put him in a little cage. I climbed down out of the tree, and he went over and actually, I'll never forget this, after he kind of regained his composure, the hair stood up on his back, and he started bluff charging us from inside that cage. You know, a little 15-pound cub actually was that bold. So I remember we nicknamed him Les from Les Nessman on WKRP too. So we put him in a cage, actually got his weight up to, and then released him out in the wild, and I never heard from him again too. So that was a kind of I guess a good ending to kind of a sad story with the mother being killed.
It's funny that you inspired a memory of mine, and I think every bear biologist, especially black bear biologists, will have a story of being in a tree with a bear. And well, when you were telling your story, it reminded me. I have another little story of catching cubs, and we had an issue. This is up around Gatlinburg, and so because it was outside the park. Do you remember Doug Scott? Doug Scott was the bear guy for Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And so I was still working at the Bear Center, and we had an issue with 3 cubs up in an apple tree in Gatlinburg. And the woman who owned the apple tree, the yard, she was upset because nobody was coming to rescue the cubs. And we tried telling her over and over, just leave the cubs alone. Mom is probably nearby foraging. You got to get away from that area. And she would not leave that area. And she was calling all the news stations. She was really exacerbating the problem by not leaving the bears alone and calling in all this press to come and videotape these bears. And so I arrived on site, and Doug Scott, who is, again, the Tennessee bear guy at the time, I looked at him and I said, what do we do? And he's like, how bad is it? And I said, well, the press will be here in about 10 minutes. And he goes, I'm going up the tree. You catch them. And it didn't click what he just told me I was going to do. And so Doug started shimmying up the apple tree. And these cubs were only about 10, 12 pounds. But again, you don't want to handle a 10, 12-pound cub in your bare hand because they'll be biting and clawing. And so I looked around, and there was one other gentleman who was just walking in the neighborhood, and I lassoed him and brought him over, and I got a blanket out of my truck. And so Doug was up in this apple tree chasing these cubs around, and each time he had grabbed one, he's like, all right, ready? And just like you said, the skydiving bear, we had cubs dropping out of the apple tree. And as soon as they hit that blanket, I was zipping them up so they couldn't scratch, because they're little Tasmanian devils when they hit that blanket. And I was dropping them into a little carrier. And fortunately, we got all 3 cubs in there. We loaded the carrier in the back of the TWRA truck, and then we left literally 2 minutes before all the news stations showed up. So the funniest part about this whole story is we just waited about 30 minutes until the crowds dispersed, and we released the cubs nearby, not in the apple tree, but released the cubs nearby, and sure enough, Mom was in that area, and she grabbed her cubs and whisked them away. So again, oftentimes it's people that are the biggest issue when we're dealing with bears.
Daryl, you might pull up another question. While you do that, I'm going to tell a quick story about a bear that I caught out in Cosby Campground. And of course, a lot of people, anytime you have a bear situation where you're going to capture a bear, there's going to be a lot of people there too. People want to see and to see what's going on too. And back in the 70s and 80s, we didn't have a book that told us how to do certain things too. So a lot of it was trial and error. And I remember I darted a fairly large bear that was a garbage bear there in Cosby. And it had never happened this before. Of course, I'd only been working a few years, but the moment I darted this bear, he went to a large poplar tree and went up to the very top of that thing with the dart kind of still stuck in his rear end. And I went, holy smoke, what have I done? Well, anyway, the bear was going to go to sleep. I knew that. And I could probably estimate he was going to fall out of a tree and probably injure it or kill it with all these people watching. So the first thing I did is the moment he went to the top of that tree, I told everyone to leave. So I had every single person go back to the campsite where this bear could not see anyone very close to this tree. And I got back to my vehicle and just sat there and probably said a prayer or two that this bear would come down. And so I could see the animal's head starting to kind of go back and forth, a little bit, started getting a little groggy. And he got on the side of the tree and he was kind of holding his head back and forth. Then he slid down for 3 or 4 feet. And so he stood there for a second, his head's still going back and forth, slid down 3 or 4 more feet. And he kept on doing that and went all the way down that tree. And I kept thinking, please come on down farther. And he got down to about 5 foot of the bottom of the tree or the ground. And I remember his head was extended back as far as he could, holding this tree as hard as he could hold with his head all the way back. And finally, he just let go and fell about 4 or 5 feet under the ground and didn't injure him too. And I mean, it was the most terrifying thing for me, thinking for sure that I was actually going to see this bear actually fall, 50, 60 feet out of a tree and actually get killed. And so from that point on, I kept people away. And I said, look, when we dart this thing, I do not want it to feel threatened. And so we would move people back and really was thinking maybe this bear wouldn't go up a tree. But that's kind of one thing happened for me, Daryl, too, that turned out okay.
Okay, we're going to move on to another question. And the cool thing is it's Shirley Lofton who's joining us tonight. She sent in a Facebook question. And Kim, I'll let you think about this one. But Shirley asked us, what is the scariest run-in you ever had with a bear?
Well, that's a pretty easy one for me. I've had some, bears chase you around vehicles and things like that too. And you kind of feel like, you're kind of in control, even though you're running from a bear chasing you around a vehicle or bluff charging you. And it's a charge that they actually come at you trying to get you to move back or to get your food from you too. But probably the most memorable, scariest situation I had was just outside of campsite 13, Sheep Pen Gap, which is near Gregory Bald. So Sheep Pen's kind of in between Gregory Bald and Parsons Bald. So I was actually up hunting wild boar the first year. That's kind of what my job was, to stay in the backcountry and hunt wild boar that are nocturnal, primarily at nighttime. So anyway, I was up there, and it was right at dark. You start hearing the birds chirp, and it was kind of getting quiet, and you're kind of listening for wild boar rooting or making sounds or whatever. Well, I heard something. I looked over to my right, and I saw this white-tailed deer running fairly quickly through the vegetation and then across the trail and went on the other side of the trail and disappeared. Then I looked back again, and I could see behind it, here was this huge black bear following this white-tailed deer. And I thought, goodness gracious, surely to goodness he's not trying to catch it, but that's what he was trying to do. So the vegetation was at a height to where his head was just sticking just above the vegetation. So he was trying to see which way this deer was going. And I thought, I said, I'll have some fun with this old boy. I'll blow, which is an alarm signal. I'll blow at this bear, thinking I'm a deer, and we'll just see how he responds. Well, I found out. When he got close to the trail, I blew at him like a kind of an alarm signal for a white-tailed deer. And he stopped and looked at me and just like stared at me for a second. Then he started walking directly toward me. And I kept thinking, why is he doing that for? Well, he kept on getting closer and closer. Of course, at that time I was saying, okay, Bear, it's me, Bear. I won't do that again. I'm very sorry. And he actually got on the trail, and was walking my direction. And I kept thinking the wind was blowing in my face, so I knew he could not smell me. So I was backing up, and by this time I was screaming, "Hey, bear, get away, bear, too." I was yelling, screaming, and he was not breaking stride. He was going directly to me, thinking I guess I was the fattest deer that he had ever seen in his life. And he got probably 6 feet from me, and I had the shotgun, and I knew, I said, if I happened to shoot this bear and kill it, I knew I would not have a career with Park Service. But I did discharge the firearm above his head. I shot the gun above his head, and I'll never forget this. He stopped and looked at me, didn't flinch or anything. He stopped and looked at me just like 5 or 6 feet away and stuck his nose out like he was trying to smell me, and slowly turned around and walked back down the trail. Well, you could have touched me and I would have fell over like a big tree. I mean, I know I had to go back and clean my britches out because it scared the living fool out of me, because I'm 5 miles or so from my vehicle, and there's no one else up there that could help me if anything happened to. So that was a pretty scary time for me, and I can promise you I never did that ever again to a bear. Probably the same bear when we would go to our camp in just below campsite 13. We had an old fuel drum that was there left over from the CCCs when they built the trails in the park, and that's where they stored, I'm sure, a lot of their food and things as well too. Well, I did the same thing. Well, I'd come in from a long night hiking either Doe Knob or Parsons Bald, and I would come back in, and I would lay down in the my bed, and I would just about get to sleep, and that darn bear would go up there, and he would hit the side of that big old metal fuel drum like a bass drum, and he would beat that thing, it seemed like, for the next hour or so too. So excuse me. So that was a little uncomfortable, knowing he was that close, and he had my attention. So that's a couple, Daryl, that I wasn't really excited about at the time.
Well, I'll tell a real quick one. Obviously, working at the Bear Center, I was mostly dealing with some fairly small bears. And so it wasn't so much scared of those bears. The one that does pop into my mind, though, I remember one time working at the Bear Center, I was out working somewhere else on the property, and we had to go down or I had to go down and feed the bears at least once a day, and I would sling acorns and apples and all sorts of fruit over the fence, so the bears that I had in my care would have to forage for their food. And at that time, I was going to Tuckaleechee Trout Farm, which is not too far away from the Bear Center, and it was, besides the trout farm, is a restaurant. And so at the end of every day, they would have 5-gallon buckets of fish parts, like the head and guts, all the smelly, rank stuff that you could imagine, but the bears loved it. And so one evening, I was late getting to feed the bears, and so I had to walk down to the bear pens, which was probably about a 100-yard walk through the forest from where I was living. I was living on site in that trailer. And so it was already getting dark. It was almost dark by the time I got down there, and I had 2 5-gallon buckets with me. One with all the fish parts, the other one with strawberries and apples, all the really good vegetable or fruits. And so at the time, I had a couple of fairly decent sized bears I was caring for. And whenever I'd feed, I'd look through the blinds to see how the bears were doing. And I noticed I had 2 bears at the time, and they were pacing back and forth. There was something going on. They were acting all nervous, all agitated, and there was something wrong, but I had no idea. You could just tell something was going on with these bears because they were just pacing back and forth, would not stop, didn't pay any attention to the food. So I just took mental note of it. I recorded in the notebook I had, and at this time it was almost completely dark. No moon that night. It was like dark, but I didn't have a flashlight. I knew my way up the trail. And so I got finished locking up the bear pens because we had to lock them up every day. And so I walk out, I lock it up, and where the Bear Center is in Townsend, you can walk for miles and hit the park, and there's a lot of wild areas, and there's bears all over. And I'm standing there, and I thought I heard something in the bushes nearby, and I'm looking, trying to figure out what was going on because my bears were so nervous. And all of a sudden, from very, very close range, I heard the, and Kim has demonstrated before, that's what a bear will do. He'll huff at you when they're agitated. And this was, I almost felt the breath. It was so close, but I couldn't see anything. I had no flashlight. It was black, and I'm standing there with buckets dripping with trout juice and strawberry juice. And I wasn't too nervous. Because I've dealt with bears. I'm like, oh, there's a bear here. That's what has my bears all agitated. So I just the hair on the back of my neck kind of stood up because I knew this bear was close to me, but I didn't know where he was. And so I walked back up the trail, nice and calm, didn't run or anything, just walked leisurely. Nothing happened. Put the buckets away, washed them out. And then I went back up to the cabin, turned the outside light on, and I was going to make a bonfire. I wanted to see the bear that huffed at me because he was so close. And that's when my wife had come to the door and said, "Daryl, get in here," because the neighbor had called. About 20 minutes had passed. The neighbor had called and said the largest bear she's ever seen just tried getting up on their porch, and she was only a few hundred yards down from me. And they had this big black lab named Clyde that weighed about 150 pounds. And she said this bear was 3 times the size of Clyde. And so it was a 400-pound bear, over 400-pound bear. And then that's where the kind of nervousness came, because that 400-pound black bear was so close to me. He huffed at me, and like I said, he was right there. I couldn't see him because he was in the brush. But he let me go. But it was afterwards that you get the tingly feeling like, holy moly. So anyway, that is one of my favorite run-ins with a bear in the wild. So.
Darryl, I've got a question for the group too. The largest bear weight-wise on record in the Smokies. Does anyone would like to guess how much the largest bear weight-wise that we've ever recorded? I'm just interested about that. Daryl, do you want me to tell the story about the worst camping trip ever now? It's kind of a scary story, but funny story too. You want to do that now, or do you want to do another?
With Blake?
Yes.
Let's hold off on that. Let's look at some of these answers.
Yeah, that's good. Just let you guys know the largest male black bears in North America are in Pennsylvania and the coastal counties of North Carolina. Those are the biggest. They get bears over 700, even had one over 800 pounds too. But the biggest one that we had registered in the Smokies, which was killed illegally by a person that was hunting on the park boundary right at the Gatlinburg boundary, it weighed 620 pounds. So there was another bear that apparently was a garbage bear out of Top of the World, which is between Wallen and the Chilhowie Lake, and they estimated it was around 600, but it never actually was weighed. So
that is the one from Coy Parton, I think.
The one from Coy Parton was in North Carolina, and it weighed over 800 pounds.
Oh, okay.
It was over 800.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't understand is black bears are not as big as many people think. Typically, an adult male black bear will be in the 250 to maybe pushing 400 pounds, especially before they're denning up. But on average, they're in that 250 to 400. Females are even smaller than that. Females will usually go 200 to 300 pounds. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to another question because we're going to get into a little bit of biology. And if you don't mind, Kim, I'd like to start off answering this, and then you could chime in. But one thing that a lot of people ask, especially in the East, do bears really hibernate in the Smokies? And oftentimes I hear someone will ask a question on Facebook, and other people will chime in to say, oh, bears in the Smokies don't hibernate. And there's this huge misconception that bears in the Smokies don't go into hibernation. And I want to kind of nip that in the bud. They do hibernate. Bears do it. Black bears, and well, all bears do it a little bit differently than true hibernators, and I'll explain that in a second. But in this, whenever you talk about the term hibernation, if you look at the definition, it's kind of sleeping through the winter or sleeping through some of the harder months, and bears, without a doubt, do that. Even in the Smokies, even in Florida, some of those other places, they might not sleep as long, but they go through this really slow dormant period. And so as far as hibernation goes, yes, bears in the Smokies hibernate. Kim could attest that we've been in on dens, countless dens. We've done so many different bear studies. Dr. Pelton headed up this tri-state study back in the 70s between Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia, where they were looking at all these different characteristics of bears when they go in the den, when they come out of den, and it was truly a wonderful, wonderful study that they do. But bears in the South, in the Smokies, do hibernate. Now, having said that, from the biological standpoint, a bear does not hibernate like many other animals. Like if you look at a groundhog or one of those typical animals you think of when it's hibernating, those true hibernators, their body temperature drops tremendously to just above freezing. They're literally 37, 38 degree body temperature. So they're literally in a frozen coma. A bear will slow down its respiration, slow down its heart rate, but a bear's body temperature only drops about 7 or 8 degrees. It'll be in the low 90s, which is really, really warm. So the bear is pretty much in a deep sleep. So they can wake up quickly. You try to wake up a woodchuck or something like that, it's going to take a day or two before they get their temperature up to speed and their body can function again. A bear can start waking up literally within a few minutes. And so bears in the Smokies do hibernate. They just do it differently. There's a technical term that people will call it torpor, and some biologists try dazzling people and they end up confusing people. But yeah, bears will sleep for a good part of the winter, even in the Smokies. Kim, anything you want to add?
No, I tell people that of course they do sleep. It's just like an extended sleep, and they'll actually change den locations, during the winter as well. And a lot of times we have picked up a little newborn bear cub that the mother apparently was transporting it from one den site to another, and either got startled or scared or something and dropped it on the trail and basically deserted it too. So a lot of people don't realize that what's unique about bears in the Smokies is a lot of them will den actually in cavities of trees, 30, 40, 50 feet off the ground, up in a little notch in a tree, which is kind of unique for the Smokies. Sometimes the tree will be hollow, and they'll climb up to the top of the tree, go into the entrance or through the hole, and then they'll actually crawl all the way back down, and they'll actually be laying at ground level, but they're inside the tree. So you can imagine, as far as staying warm and being comfortable, there's not a better place as well too. Remember, we were moving bears from the park to Big South Fork one time, and we had a bear in that same situation, probably 35 feet or so up the tree, went through the little hole, the opening to the hollow tree, all the way down to the very bottom. So we took a very long jab stick or a pulse syringe, and we had it full of drug, and we actually slowly went down inside and injected the mother, actually put her to sleep, and then we measured from where the entrance to the tree was, or the hollow tree, down to the ground. We measured that, and then we went on the outside and measured it. Then we took a chainsaw and we actually cut a little window out in the hollow tree, pulled a block of wood out, and then reached inside and got the mother with the cubs, and then transferred her down to a vehicle where we could transport those up to the Big South Fork to try to establish a population of bears up in that area too. So that was pretty interesting. So yeah, they'll den off the tree, off the ground a good distance. They'll use blowdowns. They'll actually excavate in a root ball too to do that. But typically they don't use the same den every single year, and they'll actually move from one den to another if they're disturbed by dogs or by another animal, or if it's flooded with heavy rains, they'll move den locations.
So, Marlene, I think Kim answered your question. Here's the thing to understand. A bear will den wherever there's a place available for them. And so in the Smokies, there are lots of these hollowed out trees. And so they found a huge amount, or I think it was the majority, according to the study, will den up in some type of tree cavity. Now, you go out west where you don't have these big oak trees that hollow out, and they got these pine trees, but there's a lot more rock crevices. And so literally it's whatever's on the landscape that's conducive for the bear to den in, that's what they're going to use. And so that'll lead to this next question. This was actually my question because I wanted to ask Kim, what's the strangest place you've ever found a bear hibernating?
Probably one of the most unique places that we heard was actually as the bear population started to increase in the park too. Bears were kind of starting to move outside the park and establish, but we got a call from Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, and they said, we're over here, and bears are coming out of their dens right now, and you will not believe where a bear had been hibernating over the winter. It was actually underneath the floor, and one was under the porch on some of the rental cabins, and I actually were renting the cabin out to people over the winter. And there was a bear actually hibernating under the front porch and under the house too. We've also had bears that actually hibernate over in Asheville, actually hibernate in the highway median for the entire winter. We had bears that will actually that will den right adjacent to a road. We're talking about within 10 to 15 feet off of a busy highway. They'll find the right kind of tree, and they'll actually den in that location. We won't know it until the next spring when the cubs start coming out too. So that probably, under a house or under a front porch is probably one of the kind of the weirdest places that I've ever heard about.
Okay, there's a couple of questions here that we could address. Molly said, so if you move the denning mother and the cubs, when do they want to return to their original territory? I'll let Kim address that. The one thing I will say, Molly, is typically when the female has the young cubs, they tend not to move unless they have to. Kim mentioned like the flooding. But for the most part, a mother with newborn cubs, she's not going to move her den if it's a totally adequate den. So they tend not to move unless they're forced to move because they were disturbed by one reason or another. I'll just finish. Generally, they're not moving very far. So if one den site gets wiped out, they're going to find the closest place or the most suitable place as close by as possible. So they're not really leaving their territory. And then, Kim, if you want to answer, do they use the same den year after year?
Oh, well, they typically do not use the same den from one year to another. So that's based on some of the work that University of Tennessee did, and Frank Van Manen in the Smokies as well too. I'm just looking at some of these questions right here. Maya has to leave, so sorry you have to leave.
Maya's the one from Greece. Okay, Molly asks Kim, how did you get your spark to study bears?
Well, that's interesting. I guess it was just by association. I started working in wildlife management there too, and it was a very diverse job. Of course, in the late 70s and early 80s, the bear population was estimated to be between 200 to 400 bears park-wide in about 500,000 acres. And it started to increase too. Of course, also the visitation was starting to increase too. So we were having more and more bear encounters, more and more bear incidents as well with people. And so it was really, I'm kind of the guy I like to fix things if I can. And so I knew that if we worked hard enough, we could figure out a solution to try to keep from having to move so many bears or have to euthanize so many bears in the park. And so I guess it was trying to figure out a way to solve a big problem too, not just for the Smokies, but for a lot of other parks as well too. But I mean, who wouldn't love to work with bears? Because think that's why a lot of people are listening here tonight too. There's just something about black bears that just sparks, I think, an interest in us. It's just they're a symbol of wilderness. They're a symbol of wildness too, and just what they're capable of, the speed, how well they can climb, how strong they are, how they can survive under unbelievable circumstances as well. So, I mean, who wouldn't, get an interest in working with bears if given the opportunity?
Okay, Jan asked a question. I could address this. Jan asked, what about genetic diversity? Can bears identify when they're related? Is there a problem with inbreeding? And Jan, typically with many mammals, bears, deer, lots of mammals have behavioral characteristics that help prevent inbreeding. So when a mother bear produces a litter of cubs, she might have, say she has 2 or 3 cubs, typically those cubs are going to stay with the mom for about 1.5 years. So she'll give birth while she's in the den. Then she comes out, those cubs stay with her that whole first year, and then they'll go back into the den with her. And then that following spring, when they emerge from the den, they'll be called, quote unquote, yearlings. Now, it's at that time that those yearlings disperse from the mother because she's literally getting ready to breed again. Now, typically in, like I said, many mammal species, the female will tolerate her female offspring in the area, but they don't tolerate the male offspring. And so usually the male bears, and this is why oftentimes lots of male bears, young male bears, get into trouble, is because they're getting kicked out of the territory. And so when they get kicked out, obviously it's going to prevent them from breeding back with mom. But those young male bears will then disperse, go into new areas, so they're spreading their genes farther and farther away from where they were born. And so that happens with a lot of species. Deer do the same thing, where the female offspring are sometimes tolerated by the mother, but they're not tolerated, the male offspring are not tolerated within the mother's territory. And so oftentimes they just kick those male offspring as far away. And that's why it's a tough life being a young male. I can attest. All right. What else do we have here? Any questions you want to address, Kim?
I think Molly had asked about if you moved a mother that was denning with her cubs, would they want to return to the original territory? Well, I guess the short answer to that is yes, they probably would want to return if they possibly could. The distance you move them apparently has some impact whether they return or not. The amount of food they have where you release them, the time of the year, and actually the bear density. So all those factors come into play to really decide whether those animals try to move back. The older the animal, I probably would say they're a little more territorial in their instinct to try to return back home. Males are probably stronger than females trying to return back. And if we have time, we'll talk about Bear 75 and how far he traveled, try to get back to Cades Cove. So, yeah, they will. I'll tell you one case I remember up at just below Newfound Gap. I had a mother with 2 cubs that I captured, and we put ear tags in them, did put radio collars back in the early 80s. And we moved her about 30 miles or so over to Mount Sterling Gap over on the very eastern edge of the park and let her go. Let me think about this. 2 years later, I think, I never heard from the mother ever again, but 2 years later, those 2 cubs returned back to that same location I had caught them 2 years previous, as basically 2.5 years old, and actually returned back to exactly the same spot I caught them earlier too. So I don't know. I don't think they were with the mother. I don't think the mother came back, but they somehow found their way back from the eastern part of the park back over to the central part, which was probably their home territory. So I know they're very, very strong ability to be able to find their way back. How they do that, I'm not sure. They do not have rods and cones in their eyes, kind of like birds do, to be able to navigate north and south. So I don't know how they do what they do, but they're just phenomenal animals as far as navigating this very rough terrain.
I'm going to address a question from Marlene, who said, "Are they hard to wake up, and can they hear you when you're out hiking?" It all depends on when when you're near that den. And so bears, like I said, they're not zonked out in a coma. They're in a deep sleep. So if there's a lot of commotion, if there's a dog barking, yes, you can wake them up. Oftentimes, when we would go into a bear den, we have to sedate the mother because she will wake up. Usually, when you first approach them, if they're sleeping, you could hit them with a jab stick. Sometimes they'll start that waking period, but they're usually really groggy, kind of slow moving for a few minutes. That's the best time to hit them with the drug. But I got to tell you one quick story about that. Many of you know that I worked for the Bear Center, and at one point I had these neonatal cubs. They were only a few pounds when we got them. And the best mother for a neonatal cub is not a human. It's terrible when they're at the Bear Center. And so if we can foster out an orphan neonatal to a wild female mother, it stands a much, much better chance of being a wild bear when it grows up. And so at one point, I had 3 of these neonatals that came from North Carolina, and we were going one by one, finding a female bear in the wild that had just given birth. And we would take one of those neonatals and foster that cub to her. So when we're all done with the den study, we would put the mother back in the den, put all of her natural cubs in the den, and we'd add 1 orphan cub. And as a precaution, we put Vicks Vapor Rub. Whether or not that was necessary is unknown, but it definitely helps to get all the bears smelling exactly alike so she doesn't smell a foreign cub in the den with her. Anyway, the reason I bring this up, because one of the den sites, Jay Clark, used to do a lot of bear studies in the Smokies back when Kim and I were in our heyday. And Jay was tracking and finding a lot of these bears, and he had called me up and said he had located a bear on the backside of the park, and we were going to take a neonatal to it. And so as we were hiking there, he had located the den site the day before, but he located coming from the different direction. So the next day when we were taking the orphan cub out to this den, things were looking a little different because he didn't approach the den from that direction. And he was having trouble finding it. And so the whole time I'm walking with Jay to this den site, the neonatal I had was bawling like crazy, simply because you try not to feed them. You want them as hungry as possible when you put them in the den with the mom so that cub begins nursing right away. And so the little black bear cub I was holding was crying like crazy. So we're hiking up the mountain trying to find the bear den, and all of a sudden Jay grabs my hand and he says, "Keep the cub quiet." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "The den is right." We were literally right on top of the den. And fortunately at that, we didn't want the cub bawling as we were standing above the den. And fortunately the cub had finally fallen asleep. But you talk about a couple of tense moments of me backing down because the mother bear was already starting the waking up process. And so that was fun. Yes, they will wake up. Yes, they can wake up. They don't wake up too fast, but they'll definitely get on their feet within a few minutes.
Daryl, I might tell a story related to that too. You know, when we were moving bears to Big South Fork as part of that research project, trying to establish bears there too, we had some pretty interesting events trying to move bears out of the park and move them up there as well too. But I remember one that it was Jay Clark was involved as well, and a few other people too. That actually the mother actually deserted. So we actually had Heartland Series there. Bill Landry was there. His sound people had a ladder up there, and we had this one mother. It was a young mother, and with 1 cub. And so the sound guy was actually lowering down the microphone so he could actually record the sounds of the cub nursing and things like that. So anyway, so we're all standing there watching. I remember Rick Eastridge, who was the master student, was on the other ladder watching as well too. Now the sound man, I remember he had his muffs on here too, his earphones on, and all of a sudden he started jerking his head back and forth, and he said, "She's coming out, she's coming out," and he was jerking his head too. And I mean, one person looked down in the hole, and I mean, here she come out of that den wide open too. And when she got out there, people went every direction. They jumped off the ladder. I thought for sure we were going to have broken legs or broken arms. This bear jumped out of this tree, and it was unbelievable. It looked like a giant flying squirrel. and she jumped a long way and was like she was skydiving and went all the way down the hill and hit and rolled and took off, and we never saw her again. So we had a radio collar on her, but she was moving, and we actually tracked her the next day to see if she'd come back to the den, and she actually never returned back to the den. We took the little cub then, and we placed it with another mother that we had with another two cubs, actually going to Big South Fork. So we actually put that cub with that one, and she accepted it. But one of the first times we ever did that, this idea of putting an orphan cub with a surrogate mother was new to us. Gary Alt in Pennsylvania had done some of this in the past and was the only person that we knew of. So we had some conversations with Gary, but we had an orphan cub. I can't recall where it came from, but we had a bear that was in a root ball den across the little branch there just above park headquarters. And so we were going to take it over there, and we're going to try to see if we could not put this little cub in with the mother with the other cub that it had. I remember I was looking at it, and I remember I have a picture of this, but I remember looking in the den with a flashlight, and I could see her looking at me. She'd raise her head up and kind of look at me. So I took a catch pole, and I kind of put the bear's little cub's feet over the cable and started slowly pushing it back into the den closer to the mother. Now, I didn't know what was going to happen. I was afraid that if she didn't accept it, she would bite it and kill it just instantly. So I kept on pushing it slowly and slowly, and she finally raised up and stuck her nose out and started smelling of the cub. So she stood all the way up, and she took her paw, and I didn't know if she was going to slap it or do something to it, but she actually reached out and got a hold of it and pulled that cub in underneath her for it to nurse, and she accepted it too. So we were pretty relieved that happened too, but we were pretty cautious and didn't know for sure if it was going to happen. But so we've actually put a few orphan cubs in with surrogate mothers and been successful with it.
Okay, what I'm going to do real quick, I'm going to do a speed round and address some of these questions and won't go into too much detail, but I want to make sure we address them. Jeannie mentioned that ABR will have cubs staying over the winter. They're not typical bears from Tennessee. Do you anticipate they'll seek different dens than usual? Jeannie, typically when that happens, a bear's instincts takes over. They're programmed to den wherever they can find a good den site. So those bears will den at the center just fine, and wherever they go back to, they'll know how to den. Then Molly, Jan asked a question about grizzlies. We're going to talk about grizzlies before we're done. But I wanted to make sure I answered Carol. Carol said she's a female who hikes solo. The Monongahela National Forest, Cranberry Wilderness, is a bear sanctuary. Are problem bears or cubs released in sanctuaries or both? I can't speak to what happens in other states. In Tennessee, many of the cubs that were rehabilitated were taken to a bear reserve or a sanctuary, released in the middle of it, just to give them a good chance to make their way on their own. I don't know what other states do, so I can't address that. Problem bears, many state agencies and federal agencies are getting away from relocating bears. It oftentimes doesn't solve the problem, and sometimes it causes problems in a new area. And so they try not to relocate problem bears. What they're trying to do is address the people that are causing the problem bears, and you know how difficult that is. I think we'll talk about Bear 75. Actually, do you want to do Bear 75 quick while I go to a new question, Kim? You still there? Uh-oh. I think Kim might have left us. Oh no, he paused his camera. He might have stepped away for a second. Let me make sure we got all the questions addressed.
I'm back. Sorry.
Katie, we'll make sure we get you the information on Kim's safe capture class. And then, that's a big one from Jan. Give me a second to read that. Okay. Kim, are you back? Oh, no problem, no problem. Okay, let's move on. We got a few more. I'm going to go through this quick. We already talked about this. Pamela Young wanted to know when bears give birth. Females usually give birth to the cubs late January, early February. There's about a 6 week window that most of the cubs are born. There's always anomalies here and there. Is the mother asleep? Now they put a camera in a den in a couple of places. One in Pennsylvania, one in Minnesota, and she's awake. She's a little groggy. Obviously, they're sleepy. They're in their kind of slow metabolic phase. But oftentimes she's awake. She'll clean the cub. She'll roll over to make sure the cubs have access to her nipple. So um, she will sleep a lot after she gives birth, but for the most part, she will administer care to the cubs every once in a while. And then when do bears come out of their den and begin foraging? A lot of that depends on where geographically that bear is. The harsher the winter, usually the longer they stay in the den. If they're in the southern latitudes, as soon as it starts warming up, literally what the bears are waiting for. Hibernation is not a function to avoid cold and snow. Hibernation is a function that avoids time periods when there's not a lot of food available. And so bears are kind of waiting until that green up is right around the corner. Now, when they come out of the den, they're starving and they're wanting to eat right away. They'll be eating grasses. They'll be eating old acorns. They'll be eating anything.
I do mess with them. I tell you what, it's
but
it's kind of a
it
hard
depends
question
on
to
when Mother
answer, too.
Nature is starting to wake
There's a
everything else
tremendous
up
amount of
and new things are
responsibility
starting to
in
grow.
managing bears
But
and wildlife,
it all
too,
depends
especially in a park
geographically
that
where they're at.
has so many visitors too. So we have
Okay,
we're
whoops,
pretty
I
transparent
went
in
too fast
everything we
again.
do in the park as well
Okay,
too. And so
this will be a
if
quick
you're in
one.
charge of the
Kim, do you miss
wildlife, you
working
feel
with bears in the
responsible for
Smokies?
them, and you think what could go wrong. Well, of course, we've had a person actually killed by a bear in the Smokies, maybe more that we don't know about, but Glenda Bradley was killed May 21st, 2000. And we've had some extremely close calls. And so the decisions that I actually make or are part of too may dictate, what that bear may or may not do. And so there's a lot of responsibility with that too. I don't miss that responsibility, but as far as working with them, yeah, I sure do.
Yeah, I do. I do too. I don't get near the hands-on experience that I used to. Also, beautiful part of the country. I love the West, but the Smokies are pretty darn special, and we've contemplated the idea of kind of going back to the Smokies at some point before we get too old. And so, all right, I think this will be a good chance. Okay,
Yeah,
Kim, this is going to get us
Stacy,
into some more
it's very
deeper
unfortunate we have to
discussions.
do that.
But
But you start thinking
Stacy
about it too.
Pearson
A lot of
Johnson
people
from
feel like that
Facebook
there's
said,
like vast wilderness
if
of
a bear
land
gets
out
in
there
trouble
that
because of a
we can take bears
human,
to that
why
they'll never
can't it
have
be
any
put down? Why can't it be relocated?
interaction with
And
people,
you
and they're
probably
just
had
not.
to make those
It's just
decisions.
not
I've
there.
had to make those
In
decisions
the park,
before,
they
but
just
you probably
recently
have made more of
completed
those
a
decisions. So I'll
research
let you
project
tackle
there.
this.
GPS collars on the animals so they could track them, wherever they went throughout the day or night. And actually, they had bears that were in Gatlinburg one day, and the next day they were all the way over in Cherokee, North Carolina, too. And so the park being a little over 500,000 acres is actually small for a bear, and so they move so far. There's really nowhere we can take them that they will not basically uh, have a chance to intervene with people or actually interact with people. Steve Herrero, who wrote the book Bear Attacks, he has made the statement. He's kind of the guru for bear attacks, fatalities. He's kind of the person that kind of keeps up with most of the data. But Steve is very well respected, and Steve had said that a bear that typically has injured someone or killed someone uh, has a good chance of repeating that behavior. And so I don't know why that happens, but he says that it typically can happen, and that bear should not be able to have a chance to hurt someone else. Think about it, you put it on a personal note too. Well, if you live in a certain area too, and a bear that actually has injured someone or even killed someone, would you want that animal released near your property or near your family where it may repeat that behavior too? And so it's strictly a safety issue. No one loves to put euthanize bears at all. I know we're all bear lovers, but I can tell you there's bears out there that are bad bears, like there's bad people, and they have different personalities as well too. And some of them are just react totally different around people as well. And some of them will scare you. I'll tell you they are when you get around them as well too. But really, we just cannot afford to a bear that has an established behavior, kind of like people, and move that bear somewhere else too, and let that animal have a chance to repeat that behavior. The states of Tennessee, most states will not let you move bears on their property. Tennessee will still allow the park to move bears under certain circumstances on their property. The reason we do that is so that we have an area that is far enough away, typically at least 40 air miles from the capture site, and then we think there's not a very likely chance that animal will move back on most cases. Not all cases. Some of them will move back, but for the most part, most of them will not return as well if they're moved a good distance away as well. So anyway, very unfortunate. We have to do that. Of course, an animal that's hit by a car that's suffering too, we'll euthanize an animal too, just to prevent it from suffering actually anymore. But the ones with really, really bad behavior that are risky, that basically attack people, then we typically will recommend to put that animal down. Now, what does that mean? Is that a lot of bears? Really, it's not. When I was there, we probably put down maybe one or two bears a year, and that even include the bears that were injured or suffering, till we had to put the animal down. So it's not very often, and it's very unfortunate, but it's just it's the best option that we have to keep it safe for both the bears and for people. Most people think that I tell people that what we have to do when we have to put an animal down, we're not only protecting the people, but we're protecting the integrity of the entire bear population. Like in Yosemite National Park, where those animals, the mothers train their cubs to be food conditioned, then those cubs grow up and they pass that behavior on to their cubs. So pretty soon you have an entire culture of bears that actually have an association with people, to either break into cars, to tear into tents, to injure people, to get your food, whatever too. And so we want to eliminate those bad behaviors, however it happened, eliminate those behaviors so that it is not passed on to other bears of the population.
Okay, we're gonna talk a little bit about grizzlies, but before we move on, just want to touch two other questions. Jan asked, "Will male black bears kill cubs they don't sire?" They will oftentimes kill any cub that they come in contact with. But yeah, unfortunately, male bears are one of the biggest threats to young cubs, and every year you have a situation where a cub will be killed by an adult male, sometimes even adult females that are
Okay.
not the cub's mother.
Yeah,
So
I can definitely
adult
do that.
bears
Now the
are a
ranger
big
he's talking
threat
about
to
too
young cubs.
says they were very hungry
And then,
due
Kim, before
to not
we
being reintroduced
move on
correctly. No,
to
that's
a
not
kind
true.
of a brief
This bear
grizzly
was
talk,
that
if
killed
you want to
Glenda
address Steve's question, can you see it
was a
there?
female, which is not normal.
Steve Ellis asked a question
Typically, it's
regarding
male
Glenda
bears, but this
Bradley.
was a female with a yearling. And a couple of years before that, University of Tennessee had been studying this bear. So they had caught her in a trap in the backcountry. They put a radio collar on her, ear tags, and she was a research bear. So we had no interaction in the front country as a nuisance bear at all. They did use her as a surrogate mother, if I'm not mistaken, and they actually placed another orphaned cub with her, maybe a year or two before that too. But no, Was it okay? Yeah, but no, they had not been recently released at all. That was not true. And we had no history on that bear, as far as a nuisance bear at all. And contrary to what a lot of people may have been told, we did not know that a bear was up in
It
that
was
area was causing any
it
problems
was a year before. That was one of the cubs
until
I worked with.
basically later on. Uh, it's a big long story, but about a month prior, we had a report of a mother bear with a yearling chasing someone, and there was actually, I think, even a video of that. And these people encountered this mother on the Cucumber Gap Trail, and the woman that was there, it was her and her husband, I think. The woman started running down the trail to get away from it. The bear took off after her, and her husband or boyfriend yelled, "Stop running." He stopped, and they were able to move the bear back. So was that the same mother with yearling? I don't know, but my guess is probably it was. And so very unfortunate situations too. And we didn't know. It happened on Sunday afternoon. I was in park headquarters working on the environmental assessment to bring elk into the park. And I remember hearing the traffic. Uh, Bart, let's see, Burt Bradley was the dispatcher at that time. He and I were the only two people in the building. First radio call came in, said there's someone injured up at Elkmont. No, there's someone lost at Elkmont. Could you send a ranger up here? Some time went on. They called back and said, no, there's someone injured here, and the bears are still in the area. And I remember looking at that radio, thinking, what did they say? So I got on the phone. I called Bert and I said, Bert, will you play that back for me on the radio? So he actually played it back, and in fact, that's what they said. So I'll never forget the feeling too. I said I just started feeling really sick in my stomach, like something really bad was wrong. So I got on the phone and called Chuck Hester and said, hey, I'll get your drug equipment and your firearm ready too, and I need you to get on the trail and get up there as quick as you can. So that's kind of how that started. And I'm sure you probably heard all kind of stories about her ex-husband, did something to her to be able to cause this to happen. And I just don't believe that. His name was Ralph, and I interviewed him with Steve Closter, one of the rangers there, immediately after it happened. And it was just a conversation that would convince you that he had nothing. I'm not sure that a person could do anything to someone else and try to get a bear to actually feed on the carcass the same way this bear did on Glenda too. But probably the toughest day of my career was the day, that Sunday afternoon, when Glenda Bradley was killed by the bear, because I felt responsible for all the bears, thinking that we could have done something different, but we had no information there was any bear activity up there that caused any problem at all, or we would have been there.
Okay, we're gonna switch gears a little, and we'll make sure we try to get every question addressed. But a few people, I know Jan mentioned a little bit about grizzlies, and someone had written in on Facebook, Ashley Haskett, who's a fantastic photographer, oftentimes taking pictures of bears in Yellowstone. He asked a question. It is a long question. I kind of condensed it for him, but he asked a question about: is it true grizzlies are more temperamental than black bears, or is it due to lack of exposure to humans? Because there's a theory there that when animals are hunted, they're more afraid of people, and because grizzlies aren't hunted, they've lost their fear of people. I'll address the biological standpoint, and then Kim, if you want to talk behaviorally. But from a biological standpoint, you have to understand grizzlies, which are brown bears. There's only 3 species of bears in North America. You have black bears, brown bears, and polar bears. Grizzlies are brown bears, but they're brown bears that are found away from the coast. So like in the Rocky Mountains, those are grizzlies. They tend to be a little bit smaller form of brown bear, usually about 400 to 600 pounds. They could get larger than that, much larger than that. Those Brown bears that live on the coast of Alaska that are feeding on those salmon runs, those will get up to be 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 pounds. But they're the exact same bear as a grizzly. They just have a different diet, so they grow much, much larger. Now, brown bears or grizzlies, if you're in the Rockies, they tend to be a little less afraid of people. And one of the reasons, and this is what I'll talk about, it's the biology. They're a much, much bigger animal. So if you have 120, 150, maybe even a 200-pound person walking up a trail, and you are a 600-pound brown bear, that human is not as intimidating to you. And so grizzlies tend not to care so much and will kind of push humans around. They're not as afraid of people. As opposed to a black bear who might only weigh 200, 300 pounds, that human is a formidable obstacle, and so black bears tend to run the first sight of humans. Grizzlies,
Yeah,
they're like,
I don't have any
I don't
experience
care,
with
I'm
the
bigger than
grizzlies,
them.
just kind of what I've
And so,
been
from a
told people
biological
that
standpoint, a
work
lot of
with,
it has to do with the sheer size of them,
with brown
that
bears,
they care
but,
less.
typically,
Kim, if you want to add
Daryl says
anything
the size makes a big
behaviorally,
difference.
or anything
black
else
bears
about
basically
grizzlies,
are a little bit different in
obviously
temperament as
most
far
of my
as
experiences with
if you
black bears, but
surprise
I
a
do know
black
quite a
bear,
bit about
typically they
grizzlies. I
don't
just haven't had as
attack
much
someone.
experience as I have
That's a
with
general
black bears.
statement now. If you surprise one of them and it takes off running, typically it's going to run away. Not a problem to them. Not in all cases, but typically that's a pretty safe statement. Brown bears are different. If you surprise them, they can typically attack someone too. And so if you're attacked by a black bear, we tell people that the best response is that generally is to fight back. If you're attacked by a brown bear, it's to play dead. So those two contrasting reactions to two different bears as well too. But the size of the person makes a difference whether a bear goes after someone. I remember asking Steve Herrero about Glenda Bradley. I said, if this bear actually killed her was actually smaller than Glenda weight-wise. So in the Smokies, a lot of the adult females probably only weigh around 115 to 125 pounds. So they're not as big as what a lot of people think they are as well. But anyway, I think a lot of times just the size of a person has an impact on whether a bear looks at someone basically and exhibits predatory behavior to go after them. So I asked him. I said, if Glenda was, let's say it was a guy who was 6'4" and weighed 250, 300 pounds, what would happen? Steve Herrero said absolutely nothing. That bear would not have gone after someone that big. And so size does make a difference as far as bears are concerned. I think the bigger the bear, the more intimidating they are. And I think the more times than not, they'll actually maybe go after something they think they can actually catch and feed on.
Okay, I'm going to hit a couple of questions really quick. Jan related an experience she had trying to inform some folks, and she says, what can we do, ones that are out and about a lot, trying to help inform people? Unfortunately, it's tough, Jan. It's you. The best you can do is try to let people know what they're doing wrong. One of the things Kim and I talked about, we might mention it later if we have time, but other folks don't realize that their actions have consequences. Their actions can kill bears, and we will show you a slide. And so that might be a different approach. Instead of saying, do this, don't do that, no one likes being told what to do. But if you let the person know that their actions could result in that bear getting killed, it might strike a chord with them. Then another quick one I'm going to address. Kim asked, what about all these poor bears that are being found with a paw missing? Seems to be getting too common. I know it was an issue up in, I think it was the Asheville, North Carolina area, where a couple of bears have been discovered with a paw missing, and I don't know if the excuse or answer provided by North Carolina Wildlife satiated everyone because they said it was probably automobile accidents. Um, my gut feeling, and this is just my personal opinion, when you have multiple injuries like that, my guess, more than likely, it would be some Yahoo idiot doing something he shouldn't be doing. The reason I say that, a lot of people were blaming traps, like snares and things like that. Kim and I have both used snares. We use other kinds of traps. Traps are not designed to maim an animal. And so you
Yeah,
can catch
I
bears
guess
in
my
those
answer is
traps and
really
release them
I don't know for
unharmed
sure.
all the time.
I don't think
And so my
I don't
only
think it's
guess with the
trapping. I
injuries
don't
that
think
have taken
it's
place is
steel
somebody's using
traps. I don't
some
think it's
equipment that
covert. I
is
mean, I don't
illegal,
think it's
doing something bad. That's my guess. I don't know
cables or anything that's
if
done to
Kim, you
them.
have
The
another
Aldrich snare is
theory,
what we use when we
but
actually capture bears, and we use
yeah,
a
it's
car
not
spring, hood
a
spring
legal
on that too
activity
to
that
kind of
is
soften
probably resulting in that.
the pull on as well. But no one does that. There are so many bears now. People do not have to go very far, go into the back country to be able to catch it. Typically, people trap bears before in the park many years ago to actually go in and carry that animal out and release it in a place where they could actually train their hunting dogs. That's the reason they did that. So there's not a very good reason why anybody would want to trap a bear now like they did back in the 60s and the 70s too. But my guess is with the amount of traffic, my guess is it's still related to injuries from vehicles. It could be related to dogs, but I doubt that. My guess is probably I've seen three-legged bears before in picnic areas that I assume was hit by a car, and actually the leg would actually draw up, just held it up in this fashion right here, and the animal did fine on three legs. Matter of fact, one of them was actually turning dumpsters over in Chimney's picnic area, even with three legs too. So they can make it fine with that. But that's just my guess. I really don't know for sure.
Yeah, I guess I'll say I don't know either, but
Well, I've
yeah,
seen
it's unfortunate, but there's
a
just no
mother
way of
bear
knowing what's happening.
with
Okay, I'm
a
gonna
cub
address Kathleen, and
and
then
also a
we got to
yearling
move on.
together. I've seen that
Kathleen mentioned about
once or twice as well
some of the
too. But as
siblings
far as
sticking together.
other than that one case
Whether
I
or not that
had
was an
where
unusual
they both
occurrence,
returned
I
back
thought
to
they
the
split
capture
up.
site 2 years later,
Typically, they split
I really
up.
don't I
Kim, do
don't
you know of
recall many other
instances where the
situations
siblings
that
kind of hung around?
where they stuck together. You mean to answer that? Okay. Yeah. I don't think so. Typically, I remember a lot of the bear managers at the bear conferences basically felt like that
Okay, let me.
predatory
Um,
attacks were
the slide that's
generally
up there now, is there a
speaking not
correlation
from
between fed bears
bears
and
that
predatory
had
attacks?
uh, a strong, let's say, interaction with
Yeah,
people.
if we could
So
do it quick,
typically,
then
not
we'll
your
start
fed
wrapping
bears
up
or your
here.
garbage bears are the ones that's going to exhibit predatory behavior. But that's generally speaking, that's not in all cases too. Typically, they've got plenty of food. One thing I wanted to add too about attacks as well. I've taught classes up in Alaska before, and the people at Katmai Reserve basically said that bears that are coastal bears that eat fish will allow people to come very close to them and have no problem at all. They rarely ever look at people as a source of food. But you take the same species, the same brown bear, and you go inland uh, in Alaska, and then you're going to have a totally different response. People then move up the prey list as far as a possible source of food too. So it's the same animal. It depends on the amount of food it gets, whether it looks as people as a potential source of food. It's interesting. There, I'll put this this picture up here. Uh, this did you kill this bear? That's a picture of a bear that did injure someone. You can't see it very well, but if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see the head of a bear, the same bear in the picture, and you see a person's foot. This guy was photographing a bear, and he actually was down below Laurel Falls. He walked up the trail to be able to get a better picture, and when he did, this bear was walking on the trail towards him. It was not a very big bear. The picture looks bigger than it actually was, and he backed up against a rock face wall and was letting this bear pass. It turned and walked up to him, and he apparently, you can see, he's picking his foot up there to try to push it away so he could take a picture of it. Well, the bear latched onto his foot, and there was puncture wounds on top of the foot and the bottom of the foot. And so when he started yelling and screaming, the bear ran up to a tree, and that's where he took that picture. So I got both of those pictures from him, and to be able to deal with that situation there well. But what's interesting, it talks about how important it is to keep your food up, don't feed bears, the whole thing about garbage management too. But look in the picture, the top right of that photograph right there, someone has put, as a good gesture, put a cooler of Snicker bars and drinks and food in a cooler at the base of this sign for through hikers to go through to get some refreshments as they travel through. So sometimes our signs don't work, and here's a good example of that too. So anyway, we've come a long way as far as bear management, as far as trying to let people know not to feed bears, not let them get their food at nighttime, secure the garbage as well too. But 11 million people, you're never going to convince all of them to do the right thing, and you're going to have someone that's going to mess up and feed bears. Well, Liz, that's interesting. That was an interesting case where the bear just come out of the woods and this
Okay,
hiker,
Kim, we have two
this
questions
jogger was just
specifically
jogging
for
down the
you.
road.
Liz
And
says, we
when he got
recently
close to
listened
him,
to
he
both your
turned
books
around
while
and
driving
started
to the
yelling, screaming,
Smokies.
trying to
I was
get
curious
away.
if you had
And
any
he'd
other thoughts
get the
about
bear
the
back, and
Tremont
he'd take
bear
off,
that
run down
chased
the
the
road. The bear
runner
would
as to
take off
why he
again.
would have been displaying
So
predatory behavior.
my advice to people is be cautious in bear habitat or in bear territory about running. Some bears, like some dogs, is that they're okay until you run away from them. And for some reason, some bears have a personality that if you take off running, it kind of prompts that chase response too. And so my guess is that's the case here. This bear was actually after him. Now, was it predatory or not? It probably was. It probably was predatory behavior. I can't say that 100% for sure. It may have chased people before, and the people threw their food down. So this bear may have learned by association that if he chased people, they would throw food down and he would get a free meal. But I just know when that was a close call. The gentleman was actually dealing with the bear when another vehicle came around the curve, and he actually jumped up on the hood of the vehicle and actually made it away from the bear too. So we actually had to end up in trying to catch that particular bear, which is kind of hard to do sometimes. We only trapped during the daytime in that same one area until we caught a bear during the daytime, which is not normal. We kept it basically in confinement for about a week, kept on trapping and never caught anything else. So we had a very good likelihood that we had the right bear. So that was a very close call, Liz, though, but it could have turned out differently if the gentleman hadn't come by in the vehicle and actually saved him. Okay. Well, I tell you what, years ago when we had a smaller bear population, like I said, people actually went in the park and they camped in the park. I think poaching had more of an
Okay,
impact
one
then
other
than it
question
does
from
now.
Steve, and this is for you,
I tell
Kim.
people the
How
quality of our
bad has
poachers has
poaching been
really
in
gone
Great Smoky
downhill
Mountain
over the
National
years.
Park? I met a guy with
Because
radio dogs
before
at
they used to
Campsite
go in the
90
park
who
and
said he
camp
was
for a
hunting
period of
bears.
time. They used
I
to
got his name and
trap
phone
bears
number
and
and
carry them
called it into
outside
the
where we didn't
ranger.
have
So
bears.
how bad's
There are so
poaching?
many bears now, both in the park and outside the park, that poachers don't go in and take a chance of getting caught anymore. There's plenty of bears outside. So I remember Pelton saying years ago that the Smokies bear population produces between 50 and 100 surplus bears every single year. So something has to happen to those bears. So losing bears in any form or fashion or something is not going to decimate the bear population. But my feeling is poaching today has very little impact at all. The people that do come in and poach, and it's probably happened a lot in the past too, their whole motive is to chase bears, is to train their hunting dogs. The sport is chasing the bear as much as it is actually trying to actually kill the animal too. But I don't think poaching has really much of an impact on our bear population today like it did back in the 60s or 70s. You know what, Daryl, I got a question I forgot from someone
Okay,
about
I
who would
think
tell
I'm
the
looking
story
at
of
the
Bear
time here,
75,
and
and I'll
we
tell it,
have
but I'll tell
about
it
10
really
minutes to
quickly
wrap
too.
up. Was there
Bear
any
75 was a
questions,
bear that was
blazing
in Cades
questions that we
Cove out
missed?
near
I know we kind of rushed through a
the
couple
visitor
of
center
them.
there.
Don't know if
He
there's
became
any
food
others
conditioned with people
that
overfill garbage cans.
were really good questions
He
that
went
we
over
just
to the mill and
overlooked.
tore into the mill
I'm trying to read
and
as we
was getting
go.
the beef fat basically off of the wheel there too, and became very food conditioned. So we started moving him. We first moved him to Cataloochee on the eastern end of the park. He came back. I moved him down on the Cherokee National Forest near Georgia. He came back from there. I moved him back to Cataloochee again. He came back again. I moved him up to Johnson County near the Virginia line. He actually made it back to the park that time. In between that time, he got caught at the VA hospital parking lot by TWRA, and they told us that they had caught him and took him out of town. And so I'd move him in Tennessee everywhere I could, but then I knew we had to do something more drastic. Either going to put him down, which I knew they would burn me at the stake if we did that. And I hate to do it because he really wasn't a bad bear. He was a good bear as far as outside of his home territory. But when he got back in his home territory, then obviously it does like we do. We act differently at home than when we go to someone else's home. Anyway, I got it approved to take him up to Harrisonburg, Virginia. They took him up there, put a collar on him, released him right on the West Virginia boundary, and immediately he started going south, trying to get back to the park. He was averaging 10 to 12 miles south every single night. He went all the way back down to Pearisburg, Virginia. They caught him walking through town there, moved him back farther north, almost into Maryland, released him 10 to 12 miles south again. He went through Roanoke, Virginia. The police started chasing him, and they darted him with a drug that does not knock him completely out, only sedates him, and they roped him and pulled him in the back of a police van, and accidentally, by doing so, they pulled the radio collar off of him. They released him outside of Roanoke. He went back into Tennessee, and TWRA caught him again walking through the VA hospital parking lot in Johnson City for 2 years in a row. They moved him outside, and the next count was we got a call that someone actually had shot and killed Bear 75 eating blackberries. And so it was very unfortunate. I probably spent more time with that one bear than any other bear to try to keep him going. And unfortunately, he was killed there just outside of Johnson City. You know, I tell people that even though we lost Bear 75, but he really changed the course, I think, of bear management in the Smokies. We had more of, like most bear programs are, it's more reactive in nature. Bear 75 made me take a hard look at garbage and the role that garbage was playing in changing these bears' behavior. And because of him, I think we started really analyzing the impact that nighttime garbage was having on changing these bears' behavior. And we changed it all around, completely changed it around. And I know that there was basically dozens of bears that basically that their lives were saved because of what Bear 75 did, and it allowed us to learn from what he did so that we made a better place for bears in the Smokies.
Okay, Steve. Steve had a question. I'd like to address this quickly. He says, if a bear draws blood, does it become shark-like and become more aggressive due to the taste of blood? As in the persistence and multiple attacks a few years ago of the hiker who tent camped outside Spence Field shelter. I'm not familiar with that, but the one comment I want to give, Steve, I was asked to testify as kind of an expert witness for the New Mexico legislature regarding bear attacks. And the question, although it ended up getting canceled, the questions that they were going to ask me was exactly what you asked. If a bear draws blood once, does it become more of a danger? And there's no way to answer that. Bears are individual animals. They have their own behaviors. But the analogy I was going to use is, think of someone who is going skydiving. I would imagine the very first time anyone goes up in an airplane, that first time jumping out the door of an airplane has to be extremely, extremely difficult. It's got to be very hard for that person to do. But once he does it once and the parachute opens and he lands on the ground, the next time up, it'll be a little bit easier for him. And that was the analogy I was going to use, because if a bear were to draw blood and there's no negative repercussions, it was probably a huge, huge step for any black bear to go that far, because typically they're afraid of people. But if they do go that far and there's no negative repercussions, my best guess is they're probably not as afraid as they should be to do it again. I have no way of proving it. Like I said, each bear is an individual. You have no idea of predicting it.
I'm concerned,
but my
don't have a good
professional
answer for you,
opinion
too.
is that
Do they
if they
become
do
more
it once
aggressive due to the taste of blood?
without
I
any
don't
negative
think so. I don't think
reinforcement
so. I think,
after that,
that
then
reminds
they
me of
won't be
of
as
a case
afraid
we
to do
had
it a second time.
of a
Kim, you could feel
person who
differently,
went into
but
diabetic shock.
I'm
He
not
was a
familiar with
hiker
that Spence Field thing
went
that
in
he
shock, and he
mentioned. But
started
if
going
you
cross
wanted to add
country
anything,
from Indian Gap off the AT. He went cross country, went all the way down to Little River Truck Road. He was on a manway just above Campsite 30, and I remember they finally found him, and they gave him some food and stuff, and he kind of became conscious after that too. But he said, it was really interesting. I don't know if I was dreaming or what, but I felt like that there were bears circling me while I was there. I mean, I could see the bears going around in circles with me, and Steve Closter was with him, and he said, I didn't say anything to him, but when we were there were numerous piles of fresh bear scat where this guy was sitting. So I tell you that makes me think that a lot of bears will not confront someone, in a dire state like that until they die. That could be changed, though. It depends on how hungry the bear is. It all depends if the person runs from them or not, or all the stars have to line up before it goes after someone. So my guess is that most bears, basically, if a person is in a situation where they're going to die, they usually will wait, and actually, because it makes sense, because they necessarily won't have to fight the person at all. They basically will be non-respondent, and they'll be able to do what they want to do after that point. So I personally don't think that they become shark-like and more aggressive if they taste the blood. They eat blood. I mean, they taste blood if they kill pigs, or if they kill a deer, or if they eat a carcass or something too. I mean, they've already probably all bears have taste of blood, not necessarily from humans, but from other animals as well too. So I'm not sure that they become shark-like.
Okay, as much as I'd love to keep going, we have been going at this for 2 hours. So I'm going to start the wind down. If anyone has any other questions that you're dying to ask me or Kim, you can email us or put them on Facebook. In fact, I would prefer the Facebook route
Oh,
because
you can go to
your question
Amazon.
is
We're
probably
still on
shared by
Amazon,
multiple
or
people, and then we
if
can
you're
answer it
in around the
publicly
Smokies,
so
they
everyone can
will.
answer
They're in
that.
all the Vista
But what
cities
I
as
want to
well
do,
too.
I want to get to a couple slides here.
I'm trying to think other
Kim, as you
parks as well.
know,
Blue Ridge
has way more bear
Parkway,
experience than everyone. He's written two amazing books.
Catoctin,
He's got another book
Buffalo
coming out, but
River,
Bear in the Back Seat, if you've never read them, there's a
some of the
couple
other
of books in
parks,
there. Kim, where
Cumberland
can they
Gap,
find these books?
Obed. Some of the other parks as well carry them well, but Amazon's probably the easiest way to be able to get those. And if I ever see you, you can get them from me, either one.
Okay. Um, buy Kim's books. The other thing I want to tell everyone, if you enjoy this webinar, we do a bunch like this. And so I started this last year. I'm doing it again this year. So we put together these packages that make for wonderful gifts. If you yourself or someone you know loves wildlife, one of the things we put together, we've taught 48 different classes over the last 2 years. And so we put together these gift packages of these recordings. They're video links, but you can watch the entire class. And so the first one I did is I pre-packaged a bunch of them. We have one, I know you can't read it because it's a small screen, but we have a bear package that includes 10 recordings. And typically, if you buy a single recording, it's $12, but 10 recordings for $30. So you only get them for $3 each. But you have classes like a Cub's Life, Bear Encounters. Kim did a class, Bear Encounters. There's Language of Bears. There's Super Sleepers. So you have a bear package. Another one is a critter package because we've taught different classes on foxes and cougars and owls and birds of prey, all sorts of different critters. We have one that's really cool. I like this one. It's Wildlife Conversations. It includes all the Bear Tales classes we've done. We've done 4. Kim has been a part of 3 of those. I also did an Animal Tales that talked about other animals I worked with, and then we had a Black Bear Campfire Talk. The cool thing with that Wildlife Conversation package is $25, but anytime that's purchased, $10 automatically goes to ABR simply because we use a lot of ABR stories and we wanted to give back to ABR. And then there's another one that's Wildlife Concepts. It's literally teaches you about how wildlife survive in the wintertime, wildlife conservation, camouflage. It's just a whole slew of things. There's, I think, 15 or 14 different classes in that. So you could always do those packages and get those recordings really, really cheap. You could look on the Facebook page. We have all the links there. Another cool thing is if you don't like those packages, you can buy the recordings and you can choose your own. Like I said, we have 48 different recordings. You could buy 3 for $10, or I forget what the breakdown is. You can get them really cheap, only a couple of dollars each. And so Christmas is coming. If you know someone that is at home, can't get out much, and they would enjoy listening to these recordings and learning about wildlife from wildlife professionals, and once you purchase this package, you can ask us any questions you want. So
I don't want to.
check that out
thank everyone
on
for,
the
for
Wildlife for You
listening tonight,
Facebook
too.
page. You can go to our
Obviously,
website.
you
I
all
don't have a lot of
are
the package
obviously
information
bear
up there yet.
lovers and bear
But if you go to the
supporters, too, and I
Facebook page, you
appreciate all
can find
do
all
for,
this stuff out.
for conservation
I
for
want to
ABR
thank
as
you
well.
all
ABR is a
for
great organization
fantastic
too. So
questions, for
obviously,
bearing with
any
us.
help
We've
going
literally
towards
been on
them
here
is
for
very,
about
very
2.5
appreciated as well
hours.
too. But you know,
And
I
Kim,
tell
is there
people
anything
that, you
else
know,
you would like to
bears
say?
can't talk, and we are their voice. We're really ambassadors for bears too. And I said we'll do the best job we can to protect them because obviously the only predator for black bears is people, and so hopefully we can do our best job to ensure that we're going to have bears here forever. So thank you so much for everyone. I appreciate you and hope you all have a very Merry Christmas.
And I will package this up and send out the recording to all that
Absolutely.
participated.
Y'all take care.
I'll
Thanks.
also include information about all those other recordings for you to check out. But thank you so much for joining.